Their letter sealed in hope, opened in fear and answered in betrayal. Miss Marple knows the truth never stays buried for long. Welcome to Phantom Mystery. I am your host, Edmund Cross. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your voices make these tales come alive. Now then, let's begin. St. Mary Mead woke to bunting. It ran like bright stitches across the green, from the lich gate to the tea tent and back again to the coconut shy, a cheerful zigzag sewn by diligent fingers the week before. Children, set, loose by the bell of a Saturday morning, twitched the tails of the flags and laughed to hear them snap. The brass of the silver band gleamed. The vicar rehearsed his opening remarks to the empty air. It was, in short, the kind of day the village understood, an occasion to dress sensibly, gossip innocently, and eat cake greedily. Miss Jane Marple, small and upright and enveloped in a cardigan of a kindly pale blue, paused just inside the gate and considered the scene with an expression of pleased fatigue, like a woman who, finding her roses have at last taken, cannot quite forgive them for having required so many years of pruning. She moved on, her eyes soft behind their spectacles, a glance that touched faces and lingered on hands. She always looked at hands. They told you much that lips did not. By the jam stall, Mrs. Dolly Bantry held forth with the expressiveness of a general planning a campaign. And I said to Mrs. Pike, the new district nurse, that there's no use sending anything to the raffle that hasn't got a bit of substance to it. People like a thing that sits heavy. Isn't that so, Jane? Miss Marple, who was examining the labels neatly affixed to the rows of glass jars, smiled. Most prudent, dear Dolly, although of course some people prefer lightness, but one must be careful which sense of the word one uses. Sugar content? Dolly guessed. Or morals? Either may upset the digestion, Miss Marple said mildly. Her finger paused on a label reading, Marmalade, Seville, Mrs. Eliza Rowe. The handwriting was a firm schoolroom print, but the date in the corner, 3 Sept, had been written in a different hand altogether, the 4s a peculiar open-topped shape. Miss Marple's brow creased very slightly, then smoothed again. She shifted her gaze to the ribbon pinned to the jam-laden tablecloth, a narrow crimson thing fastened not with a safety pin, as one would expect at a village fete, but with a tiny milliner's knot, slick, tidy, and hardly visible. It looked like London work. The fete opened to the band's cheerful bray and the vicar's remarks about community spirit and improvements to the church roof. Posters announced the highlight of the afternoon, Mrs. Adela Marchmont, the well-connected widow who had taken the manor house for the summer, would judge the preserves, the cakes, and, by special request, the flower arrangements. Mrs. Marchmont had been all graciousness since her arrival, scattering a kind of brisk generosity about the place, leaving checks in saucers and compliments in people's ears. The village accepted her with that combination of gratitude and suspicion reserved for newcomers with elegant hats. "She's awfully kind," said young Lily Hewitt, who was temporarily useful at the post office and permanently hopeful about life. "Gave Mrs. Goodbody at the laundry a sovereign for a rush job. Imagine, and a ribbon for the Girl Guides, and she promised a piano for the Memorial Hall." "Promises are easier than pianos," said Mr. Pritchard, a tall, spare man whose thinness lent gravity to all his comments. "Still, she keeps people busy, that's something." They watched Mrs. Marchmont arrive, a tapering figure in dove grey, pearls at her throat, a pair of white gloves buttoned primly. Her eyes were quick and undramatic, as if they expected competence from the world and were often disappointed. She shook the vicar's hand, murmured to the bandmaster, and tilted her hat to shade her face. When she smiled, people felt improved. Miss Marple, knitting needles already in motion, plain pearl plain, sat on a folding chair near the tea urn. From that vantage she could see much with the air of seeing nothing at all. Sergeant Weatherby, of the county police laughing rather loudly at something Mrs. Pike said. Mrs. Eliza Rowe, the marmalade maker, worrying the corner of her apron until threads showed. Mr. Pritchard placing his floral arrangement with careful hands. Too careful, Miss Marple thought, for a man who professed indifference to flowers. There was the vicar's wife, flurried and sweet, and the organist Mrs. Sims, harried by the discovery that the raffle book had 2 duplicate numbers, 37, owing, no doubt, to a page torn out untidily and reinserted. Miss Marple would have expected Mrs. Sims to mind such things. Yet there she was, chalking over her unease with duty. Mrs. Marchmont began at the cakes. She had the brisk decisiveness of a good headmistress and the alert caution of a driver new to the lanes. She cut, she tasted, she nodded. The ginger cake was commendable, a Victoria sponge light but lacking courage, a walnut loaf exemplary. Who made this? The creator, a rosy-cheeked maid named Hetty from the Manor Kitchens, turned crimson and bobbed 2 different curtsies at once. People laughed, and Hetty beamed, and Mrs. Marchmont, smiling, pressed the ribbon into the girl's hand in a manner that made the gesture feel like a lesson in deportment. It was when she came to the preserves that the atmosphere changed. Perhaps it was the intimacy of jam, kitchens, dawn fruit, the measuring of sugar like a sacrament. Mrs. Marchmont lifted one jar after another, holding each to the light. She chose a spoon, careful as a surgeon, and tasted the first marmalade, then the second. "Ah," she said, "quite bitter." "Seville, madam," Eliza Rowe said quickly. "That is the point, indeed, and a point it has." Mrs. Marchmont smiled, and her eyes flicked to the label. She reached for another spoon. Next. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. The tea-urn hissed. Somewhere a child cried because somewhere else somebody had won a coconut, and then, because such moments arrive without ceremony, Mrs. Marchmont put the spoon to her lips and took a small, neat taste. She swallowed. She blinked. "Do excuse me," she murmured, as one who will not be so vulgar as to make a scene. She touched her throat. Her gloved fingers tightened and then loosened, as if someone had suddenly whispered a secret in her ear, and she was practicing not to betray it. "Adela," called Mrs. Pike. "Are you—" Mrs. Marchmont began to cough. A soft, stifled cough at first, then an alarming, dry sound that turned heads. The spoon fell from her hand and struck the table with a minute, decisive chime. She half sank, half was guided to a chair by Sergeant Weatherby and Mr. Pritchard, who moved with a speed Miss Marple thought revealing. The widow's face had gone a pale, curious shade. Not merely white, but the colour of paper held too long near a flame. "Air," someone said. "Give her air." Dolly Bantry fanned. The vicar fluttered. The band faltered. Mrs. Marchmont's mouth tried to shape a word, failed, and tried again. Miss Marple, who had risen without fuss and come nearer at an angle that did not look like coming nearer, noticed 3 things in quick succession. First, that Mrs. Marchmont's white glove, tugged off by Mrs. Pike and dropped in the commotion, bore a faint smear of something orange near the wrist. Second, that the jam jar from which she had last tasted had a ribbon tied about its neck, a thin crimson ribbon, knotted with that same nearly invisible milliner's neatness. And third, that the saucer under that jar had a hairline crack, and the crack had recently been traced with tea to make it less obvious. She also noticed, because one learns to keep one's eyes where other people's are not, that the raffle book lay shut, too carefully shut, near Mrs. Sims's handbag, and that the pencil used to number the tickets had been swapped for a fountain pen which, upon the white linen, had left the smallest crescent of green ink, the exact shade that had dated Mrs. Rowe's label. "How foolish of me," Mrs. Marchmont gasped, with what sounded like irritation rather than fear, a woman annoyed to have her day derailed by her own throat. She attempted to stand, and could not. Sergeant Weatherby, red and capable, called for the nurse. Mrs. Pike ran. Miss Marple took one step back as if the better to see. Mr. Pritchard, in the general agitation, placed his hand on the table and left behind a smear of marmalade so light one would not have noticed it if one were not noticing everything. The nurse arrived with a speed that suggested proximity rather than miracle. There was water, there were salts, there was a hush shaped like dread, and there was Mrs. Marchmont, failing. She died without spectacle, a quiet drawing in, an offended little sigh, a stillness that began in the eyes and made its way to the hands. The band, already silent, did not quite know what to do with their instruments. The vicar said something gentle. A woman's cry broke free and was caught again. In that strange pause that comes when life refuses to continue as it had intended, everybody looked at everybody else and saw with unwelcome clarity how very many motives for very many things a village contains. "Dear me," Miss Marple said softly to no one in particular, and for an instant she seemed to be thinking of the ways jam is boiled too long and people's tempers with it. "How very awkward." Sergeant Weatherby straightened, gratefully official. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "this is a terrible event. I must ask you to remain calm and to stay for the time being within the fete grounds. Nurse, the tent, if you please. Reverend, thank you. Miss Marple—" He faltered, conscious of a propriety that told him he was speaking to one who had seen much and thought more. "Perhaps you might sit, ma'am." "I shall, Sergeant," Miss Marple said, and did. Her needles, dutiful in disaster, found their rhythm again. She watched the movement round the jam table, the vicar's wife covering the body's face with a veil, Mrs. Sims clutching her handbag as one clutches rations in wartime, Mrs. Rowe twisting that poor apron hem, Mr. Pritchard standing much stiller than any man needs to stand, looking with unnatural care at nothing in particular. "Poison," hissed Dolly Bantry, who had already decided upon it. "It's always poison, isn't it? Jam and poison. Oh, Jane, how awful, how frightfully—" "Hush, Dolly, dear." Miss Marple's voice was a murmuring thread. "We must be fair. There are many sorts of unkindness, and not all of them come in jars." Still her eyes went to the crimson ribbon at the jar's neck, to the green crescent of ink on linen, to the label's mismatched hand, to the crack in the saucer that someone had tried, so very recently, to disguise. She watched Sergeant Weatherby, earnest and a little out of his depth, send a constable for the doctor, and bridle the worst of the whispering. And she watched lastly as Lily Hewitt, pale now and eager for something useful to do, gathered the dropped raffle tickets into a tidy stack. Lily's hands shook. A single ticket clung to her palm. Miss Marple saw the number, the duplicated second, and the ragged edge where a page had been torn out, not with a steady pull along the perforations, but hurriedly, as though timetables had pressed in a way jam-making seldom did. "It will upset the tea," someone said irrelevantly, "because people in villages cannot bear not to say something." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently, "it will upset many things." Above them the bunting fluttered, bright and foolish. The brass abandoned, caught the sun and held it like a promise no one quite believed. In the tent's cool shadow, a dead woman lay with her secrets. In the green's hot light, the living gathered theirs about them like shawls. Miss Marple folded her knitting in her lap. She was thinking, as she always thought when ordinary days, cracked to show the darker pattern underneath of human nature, how it repeats itself with tiny variations, like village bunting sewn by many hands from many leftover bits, how the knots, once you know where to look, are always tied the same way. The Marquis smelled of boiled sugar and panic. As the vicar's wife drew the veil, the chatter outside collapsed to a hush, made of breath held in sympathy or curiosity. Sergeant Weatherby, perspiring through his good collar, cleared space round. The preserved table, with the confidence of a man who believes order, like prayer, works if performed briskly. He sent Constable Reed for Dr. Haydock and the station kit, told the band to stand down, an unnecessary command, and asked the crowd to remain. They remained, as crowds do when they want to look, but not be seen looking. It will be a while for Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple observed, as though noting a cloud. He intended the lower lane to Much Benham. It washes after rain. Weatherby nodded, unsure if the information accused or comforted him. Lily, he said to Lily Hewitt, labels and string, if you please. Grateful for instruction, Lily hurried off. Mrs. Sims hovered by her raffle book, with a hand like a mother hen. When Weatherby said, "Leave it for now," rather too sharply, she flushed and rested her handbag on it, as if to keep it from mischief. Dolly Bantry anchored herself at Miss Marple's elbow. Poor Mrs. Marchmont, it might be an allergy. Strawberries, bees, one hears— She ate marmalade, Miss Marple said, gently enough that Dolly's theory folded itself away. Lily returned with labels and a long brown string, 2 labels sticking to her sleeve. Weatherby numbered the jars. First those Mrs. Marchmont had certainly tasted, then those she might have, and then, by the logic of anxiety, all of them. He drew a little plan of the table on an envelope. The pencil squeaked. Miss Marple's eyes went to the jar with the crimson ribbon, to the hairline crack in the saucer beneath it, recently darkened with tea, and to the small crescent of green ink on the linen near Mrs. Rowe's labelled jar. Her needles were stilled now, but her mind, always busy with human habits, made its little notes. Mr. Pritchard stood a little apart, correct to the point of self-advertisement. "It may have nothing to do with jam," he offered. "My cousin collapsed after lemonade at a wedding breakfast." "That would be considerate of the marmalade," Dolly said. Pritchard's gaze slid to his flower arrangement, late roses and ivy in a glazed jug that was not the one he had brought. Miss Marple had seen the rejected jug with the chipped lip behind the tent flap, and the gardener's quiet crossness when told a pot was wanted at once. Mrs. Pike arrived with smelling salts, and the limited apology of a professional summoned too late. "Nothing more to be done," she told Weatherby. "We should move her when the doctor comes." The vicar said a prayer. The tent breathed with him and steadied a little. Lily, easing the labels from her sleeve, met Miss Marple's look, approving, practical, and straightened. "Mrs. Rowe," Weatherby said, keeping his voice steady, "you made Seville marmalade." Eliza Rowe, younger up close than worry had made her seem, came forward. "Yes, Sergeant. You prepared the entry yourself?" "Yes, mine. I helped Mrs. Goodbody with hers, her eyes, and lent a pan to the Manor kitchen girl. We share. You dated your label the 3rd of September. I did." A small pause. "I think I did. I made out several at once. I went over the date with Mrs. Sims's pen. I couldn't find my pencil." Mrs. Sims lifted her chin. "We must keep records legible," she said with a careful dignity that asked to be respected. "People like neatness." "No one disputes neatness," Miss Marple murmured. "One only asks whom it serves." Weatherby seized the tangible. "There is a page torn from the raffle book." Mrs. Sims's hand tightened on the handbag guarding it. "Blotted ink, smeared numbers. I preferred to remove confusion. And— Yet we have 2 tickets numbered 37, Miss Marple said, as if mentioning a mislaid tea-cosy. "I noticed." "Who bought 37?" Weatherby asked. "The first, Mrs. Goodbody. She likes a 7 for luck. The second— Oh, I wrote it down, but the page—" Mrs. Sims stopped, miserable. "Lily!" Miss Marple prompted. Lily started. People pressed in. "I remember Mr. Pritchard gave me 6pence for 2. He said any numbers would do. He seemed in a hurry." "I am never in a hurry," Mr. Pritchard said too quickly, then rearranged his tone. Outside, the village sorted itself around calamity. Mothers collected children. The band packed instruments with guilty care. Constable Reed took up position at the lich gate to discourage departures until statements could be taken. Weatherby ordered stout tea from the vicarage urn. Rituals must— Be kept, and sealed the ribboned jar with a label across the lid and another on the saucer. Lily tied the knots, plain and honest. Miss Marple, who watched hands more than faces, noticed. "Not Mrs. Rowe's knot," she remarked to Dolly, almost cheerfully. "She ties for strength, not show." Mrs. Rowe flushed. "I use string," she said, defensive and accurate. The ribbon was for Pretty, a bit left from Hetty's Whitsun pinny. "Hetty?" Dolly asked. "The blushing one?" Mrs. Rowe's pride peeped out. "She's a good girl." Dr. Haydock arrived, competent frown and blunt hands. He examined, touched the pulse he knew he would not find, and told Weatherby in low tones what everyone had already named. He avoided saying poison, but insisted nothing be eaten. He would authorize removal to the manor and arrange a post-mortem. The tent acquired a discreet screen. The villagers' eyes turned away and promptly back again. "We must have brief statements," Weatherby announced. "Nothing accusatory, simply what was seen. Statements are never brief, but they went. Mr. Pritchard's was exact to self-consciousness. Mrs. Simms's, defensive, returned always to propriety. Mrs. Rose told the small tale of a borrowed pen and the larger tale of a woman, afraid she had not been careful enough. Hetty, summoned, bobbed curtsies at the tent pole. "I never tied that ribbon," she said, eyes round. "Cook says I make granny knots and should be ashamed." "Many admirable women make granny knots," Miss Marple said. "Did Mrs. Marchmont come into the kitchen this morning?" "Oh, yes, ma'am," Hetty replied eagerly. "She always looked in. She touches things. She said it shows respect. She tapped the jars. She said how pretty they looked." "Respect," Miss Marple repeated, as if testing a foreign word. The bandmaster, compact and precise, volunteered. "We played a Sussex polka and had started a Bide with Me. Mrs. Marchmont complimented our discipline. She had an ear." "Did you know her before?" Weatherby asked. "No, Sergeant. Only she knew about counting 4 before one starts. Not everyone does. People who count," Miss Marple murmured to Dolly, "often like to arrange." Weatherby returned to the table with Miss Marple invited beside him. He bent over the ribboned jar. "If this is the one, sir, do not open it," Miss Marple said. "Only look." They looked. The peel floated regular as soldiers on parade. A faint bloom on the glass suggested it had been warmed and cooled again recently. The knot was flat and cunning. The cut ends bore no fray. On the linen, the crescent of green ink winked. "Mrs. Sims," Miss Marple said, mild as cream, "will you humour me and empty your handbag on the table? Only to satisfy a little curiosity." Mrs. Sims coloured. "If the sergeant wishes it." "I do," Weatherby said. Mrs. Simms's mouth set in lines of offended bravery, and then, with the resignation of a woman who has been stern all her life and finds it yields very little, she unfastened the clasp. Out came a folded lawn handkerchief, a packet of barley sugars, a little bottle of aspirins, a prayer card for St. Michael, "Defend us in battle," Miss Marple noted, a neat leather purse with a coin in the shilling pocket for change at the teas, and, placed last, with a tiny pause, a fountain pen whose cap bore a chip the exact shape of impatience. The nib, when Weatherby turned it to the light, showed a faint splay, as if someone had pressed too hard in the act of making numbers seem decisive. A strip of torn paper was tucked in the side pocket. When the sergeant opened it, edges feathered. It owned to a few half-printed digits, 30-something, and a crescent of green where the pen had blotted, and the owner had disliked the blot, and so sacrificed the page. "I remove what is not tidy," Mrs. Sims said, voice steady and unappealing, like unsalted broth. "I have always done so." "It is a service," Miss Marple agreed so gently that the woman blinked with startlement, "and sometimes dangerous to be so good at what one does. One tidies more than one means to. I did not poison that woman," Mrs. Sims said with an abruptness that found her own fear and tried to frighten it back. "No one has said so," Weatherby answered, a beat late. He replaced the pen and the torn strip on the table and glanced toward the ribboned jar. "We'll have that sent to the laboratory as soon as we can. Dr. Haydock." "Nothing more here," said the doctor, who disliked it when Death asked for science he could not provide on the spot. "Don't move the jar. Don't move anything. Don't eat anything. And if I may, don't decide anything either." "That often happens last," Miss Marple murmured. The tent was warmer for the screen set up round the body, and the cakes gave off a smell at once homely and bruised. Mr. Pritchard, perhaps because he had read in a book that one must be helpful, asked whether he might organize chairs. He placed them with exactitude, and then stood beside them like a footman hired for an afternoon, his spare back a diagram of correct posture. Lily, her hands learning steadiness by pretending it already belonged to them, numbered and knotted and recorded under Weatherby's direction. Hetty scrubbed the crimson smear from Mrs. Marchmont's fallen glove with a corner of linen, and then guiltily put it back again almost where it had been. Almost, but not quite. Miss Marple's eyes found the almost and put it away like a pin. "Sergeant," came Nurse Pike's voice from the screen, pitched low to be kind and so audible to everyone. "We'll take her in the kitchen entrance at the manor, less viewing." "Reed," Weatherby called. "Go up to the manor and inform the butler, or whoever fulfills the office." He paused, interrogating his memory. "Does she have a butler?" "She has a Mr. Lanyon," Dolly supplied at once. "He is a sort of secretary and not a butler at all. He has a moustache and a tendency to stand indoors in a way that blocks light." "I shall speak to Mr. Lanyon," Weatherby said, who disliked moustaches that thought. Reed hurried away. A small disturbance at the tent's edge. Mrs. Goodbody, stout and rosy with the determination of the deaf who suspect events have run off without them. "Well, I never," she announced to Miss Marple, which is what people say when they always have. "It's the marmalade, I suppose. You know these great ladies. Too fine for peel." "I like peel. A piece of peel sees you through a morning." "It is sustaining," Miss Marple said. "You dated your label, Mrs. Goodbody?" "I told Eliza to do mine." "Eyes," Mrs. Goodbody said, tapping her own with the cheerfulness of an optimist. "She made a tidy hand of it, bless her, but I don't like that green ink. It looks like envy." "It does indeed," Miss Marple said, "and envy often writes too hard." Mrs. Rowe had come closer, hearing herself filed among tidiness and envy. "It's the only ink Mrs. Sims keeps," she said, as if loyalty must be precise. "I put the dates on Wednesday. There was a fuss about the piano list for the Memorial Hall, and Mrs. Sims said she needed her book to sit flat. Flatness, Miss Marple remarked to Dolly, is a virtue. It is also a condition." Dr. Haydock, finished with what the living would let him do for the dead, came to the table and sniffed lightly at the air above the ribboned jar. "Bitter almonds," he said, and then, because he knew the peril of half-knowledge in public, added, "Perhaps," or perhaps the suggestion of it. Weatherby looked grave with relief, something definite even if it was only a smell. "Cyanide?" "Possibly," said Haydock. "The bitterness of marmalade would carry it. Dirt acts quickly," he did not say, "and it can be got by those who use certain sprays and traps and who do not mind bending a rule for the sake of a quicker end. There were wasp traps behind the tent," Lily put in, surprising herself with the courage of contribution. "Mr. Pritchard said they were an abomination and would be better done with beer." Mr. Pritchard examined this testimony as if it were vulgar. "I objected to their placement. The smell attracts." "Smells often do," Miss Marple said, pleasant as a kettle. "Mrs. Rowe, did you fetch the saucers from the church cupboard this morning?" "I did," said Mrs. Rowe. "We were short because the brownies practiced a tea and put 4 in Miss Turner's bicycle basket by mistake. I brought up 6 from the back shelf. That one," she pointed, uneasy, "that cracked one I would not have chosen. I would not put a fine jar on a cracked saucer. But it was on the table when I came to lay out the preserves." "Who laid the table?" Weatherby asked. "The vicar's wife and Lily," Dolly reported. "And Mr. Lanyon. He is tidy, I'll allow him that. He disapproves of scalloped edges." "There's nothing wicked in disapproving of scallops," Dolly added. with a glance that suggested any man might, however, become tiresome about it. Miss Marple had been watching Lily's hands knot and tie, and now she watched them hesitate over a label and then recommit to steadiness. "Lily, my dear," she said, "you may remember when Mr. Lanyon came. Was it before the ribboned jar was set down or after?" Lily frowned, and the act of remembering made her calmer. "After, Miss Marple." "I think so." The ribboned jar was there, with the red bright against the linen. He moved the sugar tongs a quarter-inch to the left. He said it read better. "Read," Miss Marple repeated, as if the word were a change in the knitting pattern. "Yes, and Mr. Pritchard?" "I assisted with the flowers," Mr. Pritchard said at once. "Mrs. Marchmont had asked me to bring late roses." She admired economy. "You changed your jug," Miss Marple said. The chipped one offended. "It leaks," Mr. Pritchard said, with a neatness meant to frustrate implication. "And where did you leave the chipped jug?" "Inconspicuous," Mr. Pritchard replied. "Behind the tent flap." Weatherby, grateful for geography, lifted the flap and looked. The jug sat in the trampled grass, its chip like a missing tooth. Flies worried at an inch of stale water. Weatherby put a handkerchief over his fingers and tilted the jug. Something small rattled against the glaze. He righted it and peered in, then drew out, with careful ingenuity, a little roll of something that had once been crimson and was now dulled by damp. A ribbon, cut cleanly, tied around a very small green glass vial whose cork wore tooth marks. He held it as one holds a wedding ring found in a drain. The tent breathed in. Dolly said, "Oh," eloquently. Mr. Pritchard said, "Anyone might have," and stopped, offended by the sentence's obviousness. Hetty made a sound that was almost a sob, and almost the hiccup of a child who has been scolded. Mrs. Sims shut her eyes, perhaps to prevent anything else entering them that would later have to be tidied. "Do not sniff it," Dr. Haydock said sharply, and Weatherby put the vial down as if it might remember it was glass and decide to be broken. "It looks very much like something," Dolly whispered to Miss Marple. "Things sometimes do," Miss Marple said. Her voice was mild. Her eyes, behind their pleasant old-fashioned spectacles, were exact. But one must be so careful about what they look like to whom. Weatherby, who chose being official over being frightened, labelled the thing, and Lily tied the knot, goodness itself in a string. "Who had the opportunity to tuck that there?" Weatherby asked. "You, sir?" "To Mr. Pritchard." "You were near." "I was," Mr. Pritchard said, coldly truthful. "And Mrs. Rowe and Mrs. Sims and half the village fetching a breeze. Your constable, if we are lavish. Miss Marple, for that matter. Lady Bantry," with a thin smile. "Opportunity is common as air. Motives are less so," Miss Marple observed. "They are like buttons. People collect them, but seldom for the same reason." She looked at the ribbon, which had been cut, not frayed. The ends were exact, the knot a neat flat thing even in miniature. A milliner's knot again. "Sergeant, you might ask at the High Street whether any local hands tie so, but I think not. London fingers pinch ribbon to persuasion. Village fingers tie to keep pudding cloths from boiling loose." Dolly's curiosity had found a seam and picked at it. "Mr. Lanyon," she said with satisfaction at having recalled something, "was once in Bond Street. He told Mrs. Price Ridley, rather as a man who cannot help boasting." "Bond Street sells hats," Miss Marple said, "and hats require persuasion." "You think Mr. Lanyon—" Dolly began. Her eyes bright. "I think," Miss Marple said, "that people who arrange like to arrange and do not always mind what they arrange if it comes out tidy. But we must not gallop. We must walk noticing hedges. Sergeant, when you go to the manor you will find Mr. Lanyon has already made a list. He will offer it as if he is being helpful. It will be helpful. It will also be a list of what he wishes you to find." "You are coming to the manor?" Weatherby asked, as if he had intended to forbid and discovered he could not. "I shall go and sit with Dolly and lend her moral character," Miss Marple said. "We shall bring shawls and the vicar's wife's condolences. And Lily, if she is willing, might carry the numbers and the knots. It will look like village kindness. It often is. It is also useful for noticing when kindness is refused. Lily straightened, pleased to be included in utility. Yes, Miss Marple. Dr. Haydock had lifted the screen. The nurse and Constable Reed returned, breathless with news of Mr. Lanyon's importance, stood ready. The little procession formed itself with that peculiar modest dignity villages have for the dead. And the tent, relieved of its secret and not relieved at all, sagged a little at one corner. As they passed out, Miss Marple let the crowd close like water. She paused by the preserve table, so natural an old woman one might have predicted the pause, and allowed her fingers to rest, not touching, above the label that read Marmalade, Seville, Mrs. Eliza Rowe, Tre Septi. The green had feathered where it had been forced. On the linen the crescent smiled. On the saucer the crack, tea darkened, promised a disguise adopted in haste. She thought of a hand striking a match to a cigarette, of the small scorched smell, and then of Mrs. Marchmont, who had never been known to smoke in public, and always to do as she pleased. Outside, the bunting flapped foolish and brave. The green stretched, suddenly too large. The village looked at itself and pretended it liked what it saw. Miss Marple took Dolly's arm. "We will go by the lane behind the post office," she said. "It is shaded, is it?" Dolly asked, startled to hear a practical comfort in so much deduction. "It is," Miss Marple said, and smiled a little, as if thinking of something quite else. "And there is a hedge where one sometimes finds thread caught in the thorns. One learns all sorts of things from hedges." They went by the lane behind the post office, where the hedge had a habit of keeping confidences by accident. Dolly warned held her hat away from the thorns. Miss Marple, who did not mind a sacrificial snag if it paid for information, paused at a place where children, trying to make a shortcut in spring, had once bowed the briars, and never entirely persuaded them to resume their former opinions. There among the green, a filament of crimson had caught and held. Miss Marple coaxed it free with a knitting needle drawn from her sleeve. It was not cotton. It had the slight gloss that comes of dye meant to be seen. She held it against the light, then slipped it into her reticule, which received such small confidences as if it had been built for them. At the manor kitchen entrance, Nurse Pike gave way to a hush the house itself seemed to request. Old brick, clean as a prayer, a flagged passage with a runner laid straight as a moral. Cook Mrs. Bligh had scrubbed hands and table already, as housewomen do when there is nothing to be done. Hetty, white about the mouth, stood with her apron corners screwed into points. A maid in a cap too ambitious for her station watched the bearers pass with the fascinated sorrow of awe. Someone seeing tragedy for the first time and trying to memorize it in case it is useful. Later, Mr. Lanyon came from the inner hall, not quickly, but in that exact time which suggests the man has rehearsed arriving. He had the sort of correctness one associates with ironed newspaper edges. His moustache behaved. "This is terrible," he said, without the untidiness of sympathy. "Dr. Sargent, whatever you require. I have already unlocked the private sitting room. There will be quiet." His eyes travelled over the company, taking stock and drawing up columns. He inclined to Dolly with a correctness that admitted her social advantage, and forgave it. Miss Marple he placed, and did not guess he had only placed a chair where a door would presently swing against it. They went into the little parlour Mrs. Marchmont had made elegant without making it fussy. A screen of chinoiserie kept the hearth demure. A small rosewood desk showed a mind that liked the feel of paper. A bowl of late dahlias tried too hard and therefore succeeded. Mr. Lanyon, because order is a creed, had already tied a narrow black ribbon round a spray of bay for the door, a token to tell the house its mistress had gone upstairs and would not come down again. He tied it with a neat flat knot, his fingers pinching the ends in a way that made them lie obediently. Miss Marple, who could admire skill even when it appalled her, watched the ribbon become decorum. "Tea," Dolly said faintly, "because English women say so to give the world something to do." Mr. Lanyon rang. In the kitchen, Mrs. Bligh had the kettle on before the bell had finished being a bell. Hetty came with the tray and went away again, as if she feared to leave footprints. Miss Marple took the cup and asked, without asking, about marmalade. Hetty, grateful for a question with an answer, said that Mrs. Marchmont liked orange thin and bitter, and would keep a jar open on a saucer because she disliked sticking to the cloth. She says if one minds a little stickiness, one has no business with jam, Hetty offered, and then bit her lip, remembering. It is odd, Miss Marple said, all amiability, that she should have taken a taste at the fete and found it so very decisive. People rarely have a first taste of a thing they do not in general approve. Madame believed in example, Mr. Lanyon said, setting his cup down exactly in the saucer's centre. She supported village efforts. The preserves were to be improved by her attention. She had a most elevating influence. He moved a little ivory paper knife so that it lay parallel to the desk edge. He eased by a quarter-inch the inkwell's alignment with the blotting pad. A bee sting might have done it. There were wasps. Dr. Haydock, who had no patience with tidy evasions, said dryly that wasp stings do not smell of bitter almonds, and that Mrs. Marchmont had died as quickly as cyanide likes to act. Mr. Lanyon's mouth accepted this, as one accepts rain on a day meant for tennis. He went to the household drawer and produced, unprompted, a small key. "We keep gardening poisons locked," he said. Madame insisted. "The key is kept here. I am responsible." The cupboard in the scullery disclosed orderly jars and bottles. On the high shelf, a row of vials for traps, their corks scored by nails accustomed to expert coaxing. One had the faint ghost of teeth. Hetty, flinching under Weatherby's glance, shook her head. "Not me, sir. Cook scolds if I put my teeth to anything. I don't like the taste besides." Mrs. Bligh, whose candour could have peeled potatoes, proclaimed she had too few teeth and too much sense. Mr. Lanyon's teeth were good. In the hall, Miss Marple's eye fell on a delivery slip laid beneath a pewter weight, shaped like a pheasant. It was for the piano, new German mahogany finish, not yet arrived but pledged. The check stub, glimpse only, bore figures altered with care. The fours were open-topped, as if a small roof had been forgotten. She had seen that figure on a label and on a raffle page that had not wanted to be 237s until someone insisted. The pen in the rack was filled with black. The blotter, however, wore a small crescent of green, like a stain a person has tried to ignore into respectability. "You have been in Bond Street," Dolly said later, as if they sat at a garden party and meant to pass a pleasant minute. How droll for us all. Mr. Lanyon's neutrality flickered into pride. "I was with a milliner of some reputation. Taste is a science. One learns proportion, presentation. The village displays, I confess, pained the eye." He smiled a little at his own bravery in confessing. "I assisted with the fate to spare us the worst." "How very good of you," Dolly said, "with that sweetness women of sense keep for men who require it." She took a hatpin from her brim. The veil shifted. "Would you owe my fingers and their little tremors? Would you mind, Mr. Lanyon? Just tuck this in? You do it so beautifully." He did it beautifully. He made the net lie flatter than it had ever meant to lie. He pinched, spread, flattened, tucked. The knot was made by a man to whom knots spoke by name. Miss Marple, watching the movement of his hands, did not think in exclamation points. She thought of a crimson ribbon on a jar, and of a vial tied with the same persuasion, and of a cracked saucer slipped beneath a proud neck. She did not forget Mr. Pritchard, who had opinions about arrangements, nor Mrs. Sims, who cleaned untidily by tearing. But she allowed a small card to be placed in a small mental rack, under L for Lanyon, and did not put it away. "You will wish to notify next of kin," she said gently. "May I help you find addresses? Ladies' letters are a sort of housekeeping." Mr. Lanyon hesitated, then saw that to refuse would be untidy. He produced a slender key for the rosewood desk. In the first drawer lay envelopes addressed in a neat, brisk hand. Adela Marchmont's maid in town, her solicitors, a cousin. In the second drawer lay orderliness so well arranged it had become confession. A sheet-headed fate sequence in which cakes preceded preserves, florals came last. A list of judges and runners, a memorandum in the same open-topped fours, assigning Lily Hewitt to tickets, Mrs. Sims to record, Mr. Pritchard to flowers, neutral jug, and Mr. Lanyon to placement. In the margin, in Adela's stronger hand, a correction, "No, Eliza Rowe labels ask about ink." It was not crossed through. "Madam liked to have a plan," Mr. Lanyon said. "As one justifies a small sin by confessing a larger virtue." "Plans are comfortable," Miss Marple agreed. "Like shawls. One must be careful they do not fall over one's eyes." At the umbrella stand by the door, a strip of blue paper had been tucked, not accidentally. Miss Marple, bending to retrieve a crochet hook she had not strictly dropped, saw the torn edge and the number half stepped on, 37. She did not take it up. Weatherby, who had learned the economy of letting Miss Marple find things for him, took it up himself a moment later, and said nothing. "Madam intended to donate the piano on Tuesday," Mr. Lanyon went on when silence asked him to. "She had a speech, elevating but not sentimental. There were to be lessons for the village girls 2 afternoons. Lily Hewitt was to be recommended. It did her good to be noticed. She is very attentive to Miss Marple." "Lily is attentive to decency," Miss Marple said, and saw Mr. Lanyon mark that down as a quality to be used in others. "Tell me, Mr. Lanyon, who else in the house ties such flat knots?" "No one," he said, too fast for false humility. "It is a craft." "Ah, crafts make people confident," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes too confident. Sergeant, when you are done here you may wish to speak with Mrs. Sims about numbers, with Mr. Pritchard about jugs, and with Lily about Mr. Lanyon's quarter-inches. Dolly and I will take our shawls to Mrs. Goodbody and see if envy has dried." They stayed long enough for propriety and left while usefulness was still willing. In the passage, Miss Marple paused to examine a little dish where small coins had been left for footmen who never came. Among the coins lay a safety pin bent wrong, as if someone who preferred invisible knots had disapproved of it on sight. In the hedge beyond the kitchen door a sparrow made a brief busy noise of triumph. It had found a thread. Miss Marple smiled, and did not mention that her reticule had one already. They took the shaded path back. Dolly, carried along by Miss Marple's apparent aimlessness, found that it made a most definite line. "You are thinking of Mr. Lanyon," she said, because she could not help enjoying the luxury of suspecting someone who looked appropriate. "I am thinking of Mrs. Marchmont," Miss Marple said, "of how she arranged people, of how some people, when arranged, learn the trick and prefer to do the arranging themselves, and of how envy writes too hard, and how a cracked saucer is the sort of thing a person like Mr. Lanyon would not willingly suffer unless it served a point." "And of Mr. Pritchard?" Dolly asked, unwilling to abandon a thin man who stood as if he were waiting to be accused. "And of Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple said serenely. "For there is a sort of man who cannot bear a woman to be generous in public. It upsets his private economy." She glanced along the hedge where there was no more crimson. "A thrifty hedge takes one clue, and will not be profligate with another. We shall ask him to bring roses to the Memorial Hall at 6. One learns much from watching whether people come early to lay a trap or late to avoid one." "What trap?" Dolly asked, half with relish, half with apprehension. "A very small one," Miss Marple said, pleased at the thought of something domestic. "A ribbon, a jug, a number that exists twice, and a little game which people play with themselves when they are asked to tie knots they have tied before. I have observed that when a person lies to himself, his hands remember the truth. It is a great kindness, really, that hands can be so indiscreet." Evening folded over St. Mary Mead, and the Memorial Hall received it with schoolroom quiet. A banner for Tuesday's presentation sagged above the bare platform where a piano ought to stand. Miss Marple and Dolly came with shawls and the vicar's wife's chrysanthemums. Lily followed, carrying Weatherby's notebook and a ball of string. "There will be tea along here," Miss Marple said, laying her reticule down. "People are truer when spoons clink." She looked up at the banner. They stood on chairs. Sergeant Weatherby entered, hat in hand. "Haydoc's near certain," he said low. "Cyanide. Quick acting and fresh." "Freshness," Miss Marple murmured, "implies hands not long away." Mr. Pritchard arrived at 6 precisely, with roses and a sense of draughts. He produced a green jug. Dolly, delighted, produced a loop of crimson. "Will you tie it, Mr. Pritchard?" He did, a complacent bow that sat up like a rabbit. Miss Marple thanked him and gentled it down. Lily, at a side table, arranged fresh raffle blanks, ruling out any doubled number with the gravity of a girl permitted to be exact. Mr. Lanyon came a little late and made the room look aligned. "I have a list," he said, offering a small card. "Rowe, Sims, Pritchard, Hewitt, Mrs. Bligh and the maid, the vicar's wife, Nurse Pike, bandmaster, Nash the gardener. Address is noted." "So helpful," Miss Marple returned. "Would you indulge me with that cord?" Banner's answer to confidence, he smiled, and his hands performed pinch, smooth, settle. The bow lay flat and modest. The ends had been trimmed with a pocket knife. Mrs. Rowe arrived breathless. "Sergeant, I keep thinking of the label. If I wrote wrong, if—" "We will not borrow guilt," Miss Marple said. "Did you fetch saucers from the church cupboard?" "I did, not that cracked one." "I'd never. It was on the table already." Mrs. Sims appeared last, face scrubbed with righteousness. She set a string bag of hymn sheets down and stood guard over it. Miss Marple turned on her a smile of gentle incompetence. "Dear Mrs. Sims, would you help me with numbering? These fingers are unreliable." The pen emerged, green nib, a chip on its cap, and numbers marched across the slips, the 4s open on top, the pressure heavy. A blot made a crescent. One page displeased her. She tore it, cleanly, and tucked it into the bag with thrifty secrecy. Weatherby's pencil made a noiseless note. They took tea. Pritchard made roses obey, and Lanyon admired the hall's right angles. "Mr. Lanyon," Weatherby asked mildly, "apart from yourself, who could open the poison cupboard?" "The key lies in my drawer," Lanyon said. "Mrs. Bligh is aware of it. I attend to such matters." "Because suspicion untidies a house?" Miss Marple asked, sugar in the voice. "Nettle beneath. Because trust oils it," he returned. "Murders run on habit," Miss Marple said. She opened her reticule and laid out 3 small things: a blue slip with half a 37, a filament of crimson caught from a hedge, and a saucer she had brought to demonstrate, the crack disguised with tea. "We have a vial tied by a hand that flattens ribbon, a thread left by someone who cut across, a crack darkened because someone could not bear imperfection unless it served a point." Lanyon's smile meant to domesticate the suggestion. "You are imaginative, practical. Tie me one more knot, will you? Flat and tidy. It comforts eyes." A breath's hesitation. Then habit resumed its seat. He tied the same neat, almost invisible bow and cropped the ends clean. "Where is the chipped jug from the fete?" Weatherby asked. "At Mr. Pritchard's," Lanyon said. "Where?" Dolly chimed. A small thing could be hidden, and later discovered to one's horrified surprise. "One could also tuck it behind a tent flap in confusion," Miss Marple added. "Or one might alter figures, open-topped 4s travel, Mrs. Sims, to make generosity pass through the proper hands." "That is offensive," Lanyon said. "It would be if concluded," Miss Marple replied. "We shall only ask questions. Lily, dear, find Constable Reed, and if you spy them, Mr. Nash and Hetty." Lily returned quickly with Reed, the broad-shouldered Nash, and Hetty, who tried to stand still and stand small at once. "Mr. Nash," Weatherby said, "who set the wasp traps?" "I did," Nash said. "Twice round, Granny Knott. I don't put bows on vermin." "Who signed for cyanide from the chemist?" "Me. Mr. Lanyon sent me. Said her ladyship couldn't bear wasps. Nor could I." "Who wiped the preserve jars?" Miss Marple asked Hetty. "I did, ma'am. Mr. Lanyon showed me little circles, Did you ever pull a cork with your teeth? Dr. Haydock, arriving in the doorway, asked in his kind, plain way. Once lemonade? Hetty said, ashamed. Cook walloped me. I never... That will do, Miss Marple said, closing the matter like a sewing box. She turned to Mrs. Sims. Your pen leaves the prettiest crescent, my dear. Linen must resent it, and your fours are distinctive. One recognizes them. Labels, raffle books, even perhaps checks. Colour crept under Mrs. Sims's tidy virtue. I like legibility, she said stiffly. Is a virtue, Miss Marple returned. It also copies itself where you don't expect. You tore a misnumbered page because it offended you. That is not murder. It is habit. We all build little bridges of habit, and then are surprised where they lead. The hall listened. Outside, a bicycle went past, bell bright as a comma. Weatherby looked from Lanyon's bow to the crimson thread and Nash's square hands. We'll have full statements, he said. Tonight, if possible. You shall, Lanyon replied. Miss Marple slipped her demonstration saucer beneath the green jug of roses. The tea-darkened crack vanished in the table's shadow. Imperfections, she said, are where truth gathers. Tidy people make new shadows. Untidy people rip the page. The rest of us drink tea and watch what falls between. Dolly leaned close. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we open early, Miss Marple said. We will see who cannot bear an unarranged room. Hands tell on hearts. It is their great indiscretion. She gathered the thread and the blue slip back into the reticule, left the cracked saucer where it lay, a small bait for conscience, and smiled at Lily, whose knots were unshowy and sound. Weatherby glanced at the doors, measuring them as if they were suspects. 7:30 then, he repeated. I'll have Reed on the lane and a note to the chemist. Miss Marple nodded. And a jug on the table cracked just so. Some consciences trip over small familiar objects. Dolly shivered, pleased and a little afraid. Tonight, dawn came pearl grey and hushed the hedges. Miss Marple rose before the birds believed morning, boiled her kettle, and at 7 set out with Dolly, shawl even, gloves buttoned. They walked without hurrying. Fear that hurries shows. The memorial hall smelt of varnish and tea. The crimson thread from yesterday's hedge became, when Miss Marple laid it by the register, nothing at all, a nothing that might later recognize itself. Lily arrived at 7:20, punctuality plated. Constable Reed took the lane and studied clouds. Sergeant Weatherby came with keys and the look of a man who had argued with sleep. Tea? Dolly asked. Not yet, Miss Marple said. Tea makes people confide. First we must let them hide. They left the room as it had been, the green jug on the centre table, the cracked saucer shadowed beneath its lip, the banner askew enough to offend, a stack of raffle blanks, no green pen, only a pencil. Lily tied a scarlet bow on the lectern. It was not neat. It was honest. Miss Marple approved. They settled like parishioners who have mislaid a hymn number. Miss Marple sat where she could see the door, and the jug's reflection in the window's pale square. Dolly possessed a dustcloth she did not intend to use. Weatherby lingered in the lobby to be accidentally encountered. Reed coughed outside, the sound of an honest man pretending to loiter. Mrs. Sims came first. Disaster had given her permission to be even more herself. Her eyes went to the crooked banner. She fetched a chair and set it right. Passing the lectern, she retied Lily's bow as a duty owed to ribbon. At the table she saw the jug, saw also what other eyes would not, the hairline in the saucer, and moved the whole business half an inch to virtue's centre. She laid her string bag beside it like a small guardian. She dabbed the cloth where the ring had been, satisfied by small salvations. Virtue adores tidiness, especially in public. Mr. Pritchard arrived next, thin and hatless, cool as early shade. He inspected the room as if taking inventory of fault. From the floor he squared the trailing cord with the neat old knife he kept for string. The bow he made would have satisfied a churchwarden. He noticed the jug but did not touch it. He adjusted a rose that had leaned overnight and then stood back to be seen not touching more. "Early, Mr. Pritchard," Weatherby said. "Order," Mr. Pritchard replied, "when one can get it." Mr. Lanyon entered on a breath of air that assumed room's wait to be aligned. He set his hat on the far bench, never a table, and came to the lectern. The bow there had been retied to his standard. He noted it with a small nod and proceeded to the centre table. The crack under glass and blossom disturbed him like a wrong word in a sentence. He lifted the jug with fingers trained to pinch and support, slid the saucer out with a neatness born of dislike, and set the jug directly on wood with a tiny twist that settled it square. He turned the saucer to disguise the flaw, slid it to the table's edge, and with a fingertip aligned the card on the register as if punctuation had strayed. "You are thoughtful, Mr. Lanyon," Miss Marple said. Her praise was an observation. "One lives by arrangement," he returned. Dr. Haydock appeared and drew Weatherby aside. "Cyanide," he said low. "Not pits. Enough for a quick end. Something bitter carried it. Your jar looks wrong on top. The lab will say more." "Soon is never soon enough," Weatherby muttered. "It is when one has Miss Marple," Haydock said, and left them the room. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Sims, who now eyed the raffle blanks with missionary zeal. Remembering her pen at home, she pressed too hard with the pencil. Her fours tried to be open and would not. Irritated, she tore the top sheet, tucked the ragged bit into her bag, and smoothed the stack as if smoothing changed memory. "Forgive me," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Will you indulge a small experiment? I should like to see how different people tie the same ribbon. When asked to do it for someone else, they humoured her." Pritchard's bow was showy and alert. Mrs. Sims's knot tight and exact. Lanyon's the flat, invisible persuasion of Bond Street. Lily's honest and a little crooked. Dolly's a confessed granny knot. Miss Marple thanked them as if collecting signatures, and put each little sample by the stack of blanks, where hands might see themselves without knowing. The door opened once more. Lily's mother, Mrs. Hewitt, came in with a face scrubbed by worry. "Miss Marple, it's only... Mrs. Marchmont promised lessons when the piano came, and I wondered if there's to be no piano." "There will be a piano," Mr. Lanyon said, shaping the sentence for her. "Madam's intentions will be honoured." "Out of what fund?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Out of Madam's estate," he replied. "Or out of the memorial subscription," Weatherby added. "A cheque stub has altered itself. Numbers sometimes do when people press very hard." "Madam liked her figures to match her intentions," Lanyon said calmly. "And when they did not," Miss Marple murmured. "Someone opened the fours at the top." Mrs. Sims coloured. Pritchard's head made the smallest turn. Lily's hands folded to keep from shaking. Silence followed. Silence is a sieve. It lets through what talk would block. In it, Miss Marple heard the faintest scratch, card on cloth. Mr. Lanyon, offended by the thought of a ring, had produced a calling card and slid it beneath the jug. It was considerate. It was automatic. The card bore his name, and faint at one corner, a crescent of green like a remembered blot of ink. "Ah," Miss Marple said simply. Lanyon looked down and then up, with the thinnest smile. "Old habits. They do carry one," Miss Marple replied. "Sometimes over places one would not have chosen to step." Outside, a cart went by. "Life recommenced because it must." Miss Marple lifted the jug. "Dolly, dear, bring me that saucer at the back. I am old-fashioned about coasters." Dolly brought it. The crack smiled with its tea-darkened mouth. Lanyon's hand half lifted to intercept, then remembered itself and stayed. Miss Marple set the jug back on the cracked saucer and watched his fingers close and open like a man rehearsing patience. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "we will go to the manor at 11. There are letters to write and a cupboard to open just once. Mr. Pritchard, you will come. Your judgment about jugs will be of use. Mrs. Sims, bring your pen. You will wish to make a fair copy of something untidy. "Lily, my dear, bring the string. What shall we find?" Dolly whispered. "Something very small, half invisible, that has been tidied away," Miss Marple said. "And a reason larger and uglier, hoping to look like duty. They would go at 11. For the moment she poured tea at last. Cups clinked, shoulders lowered. People remembered to be human. It is useful, when one is about to pull at a knot, to lubricate the fibers. Tea does. They went at 11, punctual as suspicion. The manor received them with correct hush, and Mr. Lanyon met them at the parlour as if doors opened when he breathed. Mrs. Sims, summoned to make a fair copy, clutched her string bag. Lily carried twine and a steady face. Mr. Pritchard stood a little back, pretending to be superfluous and failing. "Thank you for accommodating us," Sergeant Weatherby said. "Miss Marple." "Only ordinary housekeeping," Miss Marple replied, and moved to the rosewood desk. Mr. Lanyon produced the key and laid it on the blotter. "There are ledgers," he said. Madam was punctilious. "Punctilious ladies leave notes," Miss Marple said. She unlocked the top drawer, lifted correspondence, and paused at a page headed Tuesday, Remarks before presentation. In the margin, sharper ink had bitten 3 words, Accounts, correct publicly. Beneath the blotter's top sheet lay the ghost of a check stub, figures pressed through. The 4s were open at the top. "The Memorial Hall subscription," Weatherby said low. "Numbers so often think they are private," Miss Marple murmured. "They never are." She closed the drawer and went to the scullery where the poison cupboard stood, matronly and plain, with a moral above it. "Keep locked." Mr. Lanyon's key turned obediently. On the top shelf, between weed killer and moth crystals, were 3 green glass vials. 2 had new corks. The 3rds had the faint polishing of teeth. Dr. Haydock, arriving on Weatherby's call, lifted it, sniffed cautiously, and nodded. "Cyanide strong. Signed for by Nash," Weatherby said. "On Mr. Lanyon's order," Nash added from the door. "For the traps, I don't waste." Miss Marple's eye followed a thin brown line along the shelf, sticky when someone tried to wipe, then dusty when they gave up. She touched it with a folded handkerchief and did not need to raise it to her nose. Bitter orange travels. "People who cannot bear rings on tables," she said lightly, "often cannot bear residue on shelves. One has it when one sets down a vial that has brushed a marmalade jar." "The kitchen is full of marmalade," Lanyon said. "Hetty spills it as other girls spill secrets." "I wipe, sir," Hetty said from the doorway, wounded and obedient. "Little circles, like you showed." "Quite," Miss Marple said. She returned to the parlour and considered the waste-paper basket. Under the lining lay 3 small curlicues of crimson ribbon, trimmed by a knife and forgotten because they were too clean to be litter. She set them on the desk, Mrs. Sims, torn. Between defending tidiness and dreading it, arranged a blank sheet. "If you please, Sergeant, what is to be copied?" "Begin with Madam's remarks page," Weatherby said, watching Lanyon and not the pen. "Then the subscription figures as they stand." Mrs. Sims copied. Where Adela had written piano, she wrote piano. Where Adela had written correct publicly, Mrs. Sims hesitated, then traced the words. The pen blotted, the crescent appeared, green and characterful. "You see, Sergeant," Lanyon said, "Madam meant to bore sight our inefficiencies. She was forthright. A habit of the independent." "And independence is trying for those who arrange," Miss Marple said. Mr. Pritchard drifted to the mantel and studied a photograph. A younger Adela at a charity table, a man at her shoulder with the look tidy men wear when they believe themselves the barrier between quality and the unwashed. "Her late husband," Lanyon supplied. "He taught her lists." "Then she outgrew the tutor," Miss Marple said mildly. Something knocked against the desk base. Lily, kneeling to retrieve the escaped twine, lifted the skirting and peered. "There's a pin," she said. Miss Marple remembered the bent safety pin in the hall dish and felt a small pluck as of thread through the right eye. "Bring it, dear." Lily fished it out. It had been straight, then bent awry and corrected. A waxy flake clung in its crook, thin, opaque, like the skin on cold marmalade. "Pins are vulgar," Lanyon said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and therefore useful. A ribbon that expects to be caught prefers to be tied flatter. One might use a pin to hold it still, while one fusses with one's knife." "Conscience often mistakes imagination for company," Miss Marple said. "Sergeant, ask the chemist if the cyanide vials smell of bitter orange. Then we shall know whether our misfortune began here or at the fete." Weatherby had gone to Lanyon's left thumb, where a faint amber shadow lingered at the cuticle. "Marmalade leaves traces. Madam's jewel case?" Miss Marple asked suddenly. "Ladies sometimes keep lists there. What to sell, what to keep." "It is here," Lanyon said. "Pearls, a diamond brooch, earrings." Under the tray, a folded scrap in Adela's hand. "If anything happens before Tuesday, L, accounts, raffle, ask Eliza Rowe about ink." "I don't like hints," Mrs. Sims said. "If a thing must be said, it should be said." "Madam thought so too," Miss Marple said. "She intended to say it." She replaced the note exactly. "And now the matter of a key." "The desk key." "You have it," Miss Marple said to Lanyon. "But for 20 minutes this morning before we came you did not. It was with Mrs. Sims." Mrs. Sims flushed. "Mr. Lanyon asked for blotting sheets. The drawer stuck. I fetched the key from the dish. I returned it at once." "Tidy Minds rescue keys," Miss Marple said. "It proves only that Mr. Lanyon accepts help." "Willingly," Lanyon said. "You see our cooperation." A thin look of pain crossed Pritchard's face. "Service," he said, tasting the word. Miss Marple let her needles click once in her bag. "One last kindness, Mr. Lanyon," she said. "Tie this parcel for me." She produced a brown paper packet. "My fingers." He obliged. Pinch, smooth, flatten. The knot lay obedient and invisible, the ends trimmed to discipline. "Another? Perhaps with a common bow." He hesitated, then made it. The rabbit ears sat up. "Thank you," she said, and tucked both bows away in her mind. "Sergeant, statements this afternoon. Mr. Lanyon, Mrs. Sims, Mr. Pritchard, Mrs. Rowe, Hetty, Nash. At the hall, please. We will arrange chairs on the platform. People are truthful when they dislike how they look from a little distance." "Why the hall?" "Because the banner says Tuesday and the piano is not here," Miss Marple replied. "Because a cracked saucer upsets a certain conscience, and because a number exists twice and wishes to be only one. Also," her eyes went to the green crescent on the blotter, "because ink remembers pressure. Someone pressed very hard." They left the manor in air straightened. On the gravel, Miss Marple paused to look back at the kitchen door. A sparrow hopped at the threshold and carried off a hair-thin fibre of crimson. "It is curious," she said to Dolly, "how small things prefer to travel. They carry the world's news better than men do." "And this afternoon?" Dolly asked. "This afternoon we will let people tie themselves," Miss Marple said, "and I fancy a new fact will arrive uninvited." "What fact?" "The kind that looks like kindness," she said, "and is not." Lily glanced at Miss Marple, who nodded once. Courage, like good string, is plain and strong. Outside, the lilacs stirred in a faint breeze, a weather change that often brings truths up like rain at last. Afternoon widened the day without relieving it. The memorial hall looked like a classroom pretending to be a court. Chairs on the platform. The banner squared. The green jug centered on the cracked saucer that had already unsettled one conscience. Miss Marple sat a little below the stage, where faces rose naturally into self-importance. Sergeant Weatherby stationed himself to the side with his pencil. Dolly set out cups that would not be poured until truth had warmed. Lily kept the string. The bandmaster had lent a lectern. On it, Miss Marple laid the small ribbon samples from yesterday, folded like signatures. The parcel tied with 2 different bows rested in a drawer. Constable Reed watched the lane through the open door. Villagers came because they had been asked, and because they wished to see how they looked when asked. The cracked saucer waited, a small unkindness beneath a courteous jug. Mrs. Rowe spoke first, because worry had already rehearsed her. She told again of labels and ink, of helping Mrs. Goodbody, of lending a pan to Hetty, of her dislike of ribbons because they collect grease. Under questions, she remembered carrying 6 saucers from the church cupboard, laying 5 and finding the 6th, the cracked one already on the fate table when she turned back with a cloth. Who had been there? Mr. Lanyon, she said, and Mr. Pritchard with his roses. Hetty followed, hands corkscrewed into her apron, and described wiping jars in little circles, because Mr. Lanyon said circles persuade stickiness to behave. She had. Not fetched anything from the poison cupboard. She did not like the smell, and Cook said clever things are not always kind. Nash testified he'd signed for cyanide on Mr. Lanyon's note, and set traps where the wind took scent away from the tea tent. Mrs. Sims stood at the table as at a lectern, and her sentences marched in good order. She admitted the 237s with mortification, the torn page with firmness, the green ink without apology. Legible, Sergeant, there is charity in legibility. She had spoken with Mrs. Marchmont on Friday evening about accounts. Madam had said, "On Tuesday we shall set them right in front of everyone." The remark sat with Mrs. Sims all night, like a stone urging itself to be polished. She would never have humiliated a gentleman, she declared. She wished numbers to mind themselves. She had not seen who moved the ribboned jar. She noticed a crescent of ink on the fate cloth near Mrs. Rowe's label, and blotted it, because blotting is what one does. When Weatherby asked whether she had altered a figure by request, she flushed and said never, and the word sounded rehearsed. Mr. Pritchard came next with thin exactness. His account was measured. He had changed his jug because he despises leaks. He arranged roses because when men do not, women do not rest. He saw Mr. Lanyon move the sugar tongs a quarter-inch toward sense and thought the gesture officious. He remembered a match struck just beyond the tent, sulphur in the air, and the bandmaster scolding a boy for wavering the taper. He also saw Mr. Lanyon slide a calling card beneath a sweating jug on the tea-table, a tidiness impertinent in borrowed rooms. He disliked ribbons in civic contexts. He allowed that the bow on the fatal jar had been flat in a way village fingers seldom contrive. He had not seen anyone touch the cracked saucer, but he noticed the kind of man who cannot leave a flaw alone, even when it would be kinder to ignore it. Mr. Lanyon, when called, advanced as if chairing an improvement society. He offered sympathy, order, and self-command like a carnation. He had moved saucers because cracked crockery offends donors. He had signed for cyanide at Madam's request because wasps are dangerous. He tied flat knots because bows are vulgar on civic occasions. He deplored duplication in raffle books and would gladly teach anyone principles of numbering. If a calling card had been placed under a jug, that was consideration for wood. If the sugar tongs had been shifted, that was reading the table. His hands rested on the trestle, capable servants. His thumbnails had a faint amber crescent. No one noticed until they noticed nothing else. When asked whether he had entered the parlour after the visitors left at noon, he smiled at the implication and said the house required notices to be written, and notices do not compose themselves. They were interrupted by the telegraph boy, pink with purpose, who bobbed a message redirected from the manor, for Mr. Lanyon. He opened it with a folding knife whose pivot showed a smear the colour of marmalade. He read without moving his eyebrows. Miss Marple, who never pretended not to read faces, saw the smallest blanch quickly ironed. Nothing of consequence, he said. It concerned the piano, he believed, and he put it in his pocket. Lily, collecting spent envelopes, saw the torn blue Borkeel and Broom solicitors. Miss Marple asked for a short pause, and sent Lily down to the manor with a line for Mrs. Bligh. Would she kindly look in Madam's jewel case and see whether a folded paper remained beneath the tray? The child went and returned before Unease found a chair. "Gone," she whispered. Mr. Lanyon had been in the parlour after they left. Miss Marple resumed as if nothing in the room had altered. "One last exercise," she said, "for patience. Mr. Pritchard, will you tie this parcel with your bow? Mrs. Sims, will you number these 3 blanks? Lily, knot this twine as you would for the post. Mr. Lanyon, place this jar upon this saucer." She said the last absently. Pritchard tied show like a creed. Mrs. Sims pressed her fours too hard and tore the corner, then glanced to see if anyone had noticed. Lily's knot was sincere and would carry weight. Mr. Lanyon, with fingers obedient to impulse, lifted the jar, turned the saucer so the crack faced away, and set glass to wood rather than fault, sliding his calling card beneath without seeming to look. It was too finished to be anything but habit. Miss Marple's approving smile was gentle and unhelpful, which is to say useful to her. "Sergeant," Miss Marple said in that tone villagers obey without noticing, "you will wish to obtain from Keel and Broom a copy of the letter by post to Mr. Lanyon yesterday. Ask the chemist whether a vial returned for refill smells of bitter orange. Enquire of the carrier whether the piano check was stopped." She rose as if concluding a garden committee. "We shall meet again at 5. Anyone with a little thing to put straight may discover 5 o'clock is too late." Outside, the afternoon was clear and pale. Dolly breathed. "You have him. I have his habits," Miss Marple said. "Motive prefers a better dress." At 4, Reed returned with answers. The chemist had no vial. One, paid Wednesday in cash by a careful-handed gentleman, remained uncollected. The carrier reported the piano check stopped at noon on Saturday by Madam. Keel and Broom's copy read, "Services terminated Tuesday. Prepare full account. Keys to be surrendered." 5 o'clock found the Memorial Hall quiet. Reed laid Keel and Broom's reply beside the chemist's note and the carrier's statement. Outside, the sky thinned toward evening. Inside, the green jug waited on its cracked saucer. Mr. Lanyon arrived on the stroke, hat precise, expression composed. Mrs. Sims clutched her bag. Mr. Pritchard came with chill in his cuffs. Lily slid in with brave eyes. Mrs. Rose sat near the door. "Thank you for returning," Weatherby said. "We have new information. Madam stopped the piano check at noon on Saturday. The chemist sold a cyanide vial for cash, uncollected still, and Keel and Broom confirmed Madam's letter terminating Mr. Lanyon on Tuesday, requesting keys." Lanyon's colour did not move. "Madam intended to alter arrangements," he said. "Prudent households adapt. Prudence does not run on cyanide," Dr. Haydock observed. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "It runs on tea, which we will pour." She did so, and the steam softened foreheads. They drank. Miss Marple let silence widen until it became a lane down which truth might amble, her believing itself unobserved. "Mr. Lanyon," she said, as if asking for a thread, "yesterday you said village displays pained the eye. Did Madam ever pain you with her plans?" "One works for standards," he replied a shade too quickly. "Madam appreciated mine, until she did not," Pritchard murmured. "Until Tuesday." Mrs. Sims's bag crackled. She patted it. "You spoke with Madam Friday about accounts," Weatherby said. "She meant to set them right publicly." "It disturbed me for the gentleman concerned," Mrs. Sims returned. "Public correction is indecent. I prefer a quiet change in the book." "Quiet changes do leave crescents," Miss Marple said, "and open tops on 4s. Mrs. Sims flushed and looked at Mr. Lanyon. He arranged his hat brim with 2 thoughtful fingers. "There is a way the thing was done," Miss Marple went on. "A flat knot, a cracked saucer, a calling card slid beneath glass, a vial hidden in a chipped jug, a label dated by a hand that presses too hard. And there is a reason, the ordinary kind, employment pride, and the difficulty some men have with a woman who sets accounts straight in public." The room held its breath. "It will be simpler if we fetch the missing paper," Weatherby said. "Mr. Lanyon, you were in the parlour at noon. You will deliver it." Lanyon's face wore regret like mourning. "If such a paper exists, Sergeant, it will come through solicitors. I cannot conjure what the dead chose to mislay. Dead ladies often hide in plain sight, Miss Marple said. In an envelope about music, perhaps. Ladies like things to match. She drew from the lectern drawer the small parcel tied with 2 bows. She undid the common bow easily. The flat knot took a slower thumb. Inside lay only brown paper, no document. Yet the compressed crease of a flat knot stamped the fold like a memory. Before Weatherby could answer, Reed filled the doorway. Sergeant Manor, fire in the scullery cupboard. Put out quick. Something's been scorched. They went like a small army. Smoke still tried to stay. The poison cupboard gaped raw. A shelf's edge charred. Labels curled. On the hearth, Mrs. Bligh held a pan with the authority of a general who has won by refusing to lose. A rag, she said, and the devil's own smell. Among the damp ash lay the ghost of a small green glass vial, glass crazed by heat. Beside it a curl of crimson ribbon. The lock bore scratches. On the sill a box of matches lay open, 2 gone. The cheap sulphury kind from the village shop. Who was here? Weatherby asked. Me, said Mrs. Bligh, and then nobody, and then me again. Hetty shook her head. Nash spread his large hands. Mr. Lanyon stood where smoke would not touch his jacket. It appears, he observed, that some guilty person wished to erase his folly. Or some tidy person wished to finish the job, Miss Marple said. Fire is the last refuge of the fastidious. She took from her reticule the bent safety pin and touched the scorched ribbon curl. The point came away faintly orange. Sticky threads are loyal, she said. Mrs. Sims, who had hung back, stepped in with the pell-mell of a woman reaching the end of tidying. I would not burn a cupboard, she blurted. I keep drawers. No one has accused you, Weatherby said. Better to accuse than to leave it unsaid, she returned, and looked at Mr. Lanyon. He inclined his head with grace, fraying at the edges. If I had done wrong, Mrs. Sims, I would admit it perfectly. Sergeant, Miss Marple said, very quiet, let us return to the hall. There is one more piece that wishes to arrive. They went back in a purposeful line. The hall received them with the faint, scorched smell-duty leaves when hurried. Miss Marple sat where she could see the jug's reflection. Dolly took her hand like a schoolgirl, promising not to whisper. Time drew its neat pencil round 5 again. The door opened, hesitated, and admitted Lily. She looked as if running and not running had braided her legs. She carried something wrapped in a dish towel. I went by the hedge, she said to Miss Marple, because you said hedges, remember, and this caught. She unwrapped a small packet, blue paper folded twice around a calling card, bound with a narrow strip of crimson ribbon, whose ends had been cut as cleanly as words in a good book. The card's corner bore a faint green crescent. Mr. Lanyon allowed himself a breath, almost relief, as if a piece had returned to its place. You see, he said, aiming at gentleness and reaching condescension, the village dramatizes litter. Miss Marple opened the blue. Inside lay a half-ticket, 37, and a note in Adela Marchmont's hand. Keep this proof. The downstroke of the P had been pressed so hard it showed through. There was a smudge of marmalade in the fold, and when she turned it, the ghost of a flat knot stamped into the paper. Proof of what? Weatherby asked. Of a list rewritten, Miss Marple said. Of a hand that counts out of turn. Of a plan to speak Tuesday that would not bear explaining. She tucked it into the card and tied it, because that is the language the culprit speaks, and she wished him to understand she had understood. Lanyon regarded the ribbon as a man looks at an old schoolmaster. If Madam meant to hint, he said, she has succeeded. Mr. Lanyon, when called, advanced as if chairing an improvement society. He offered sympathy, order, and self-command like a carnation. He had moved saucers because cracked crockery offends donors. He had signed for cyanide at Madam's request because wasps are dangerous. He tied flat knots because bows are vulgar on civic occasions. He deplored duplication in raffle books and would gladly teach anyone principles of numbering. If a calling card had been placed under a jug, that was consideration for wood. If the sugar tongs had been shifted, that was reading the table. His hands rested on the trestle-capable servants. His thumbnails had a faint amber crescent. No one noticed until they noticed nothing else. When asked whether he had entered the parlour after the visitors left at noon, he smiled at the implication and said the house required notices to be written, and notices do not compose themselves. They were interrupted by the telegraph boy, pink with purpose, who bobbed a message redirected from the manor, for Mr. Lanyon. He opened it with a folding knife whose pivot showed a smear the colour of marmalade. He read without moving his eyebrows. Miss Marple, who never pretended not to read faces, saw the smallest blanch quickly ironed. Nothing of consequence, he said. It concerned the piano, he believed, and he put it in his pocket. Lily, collecting spent envelopes, saw the torn blue Keel and Broom solicitors. Miss Marple asked for a short pause, and sent Lily down to the manor with a line for Mrs. Bligh. Would she kindly look in Madam's jewel case and see whether a folded paper remained beneath the tray? The child went and returned before Unease found a chair. Gone, she whispered. Mr. Lanyon had been in the parlour after they left. Miss Marple resumed as if nothing in the room had altered. One last exercise, she said, for patience. Mr. Pritchard, will you tie this parcel with your bow? Mrs. Sims, will you number these 3 blanks? Lily, knot this twine as you would for the post. Mr. Lanyon, place this jar upon this saucer. She said the last absently. Pritchard tied show like a creed. Mrs. Sims pressed her fours too hard and tore the corner, then glanced to see if anyone had noticed. Lily's knot was sincere and would carry weight. Mr. Lanyon, with fingers obedient to impulse, lifted the jar, turned the saucer so the crack faced away, and set glass to wood rather than fault, sliding his calling card beneath without seeming to look. It was too finished to be anything but habit. Miss Marple's approving smile was gentle and unhelpful, which is to say useful to her. "Sergeant," Miss Marple said in that tone villagers obey without noticing, "you will wish to obtain from Keel and Broom a copy of the letter by post to Mr. Lanyon yesterday. Ask the chemist whether a vial returned for refill smells of bitter orange. Enquire of the carrier whether the piano check was stopped." She rose as if concluding a garden committee. "We shall meet again at 5. Anyone with a little thing to put straight may discover 5 o'clock is too late." Outside, the afternoon was clear and pale. Dolly breathed. "You have him. I have his habits," Miss Marple said. "Motive prefers a better dress." At 4, Reed returned with answers. The chemist had no vial. One, paid Wednesday in cash by a careful-handed gentleman, remained uncollected. The carrier reported the piano check stopped at noon on Saturday by Madam. Keel and Broom's copy read, "Services terminated Tuesday. Prepare full account. Keys to be surrendered." 5 o'clock found the Memorial Hall quiet. Reed laid Keel and Broom's reply beside the chemist's note and the carrier's statement. Outside, the sky thinned toward evening. Inside, the green jug waited on its cracked saucer. Mr. Lanyon arrived on the stroke, hat precise, expression composed. Mrs. Sims clutched her bag. Mr. Pritchard came with chill in his cuffs. Lily slid in with brave eyes. Mrs. Rose sat near the door. "Thank you for returning," Weatherby said. "We have new information. Madam stopped the piano check at noon on Saturday. The chemist sold a cyanide vial for cash, uncollected still, and Keel and Broom confirmed Madam's letter terminating Mr. Lanyon on Tuesday, requesting keys." Lanyon's colour did not move. "Madam intended to alter arrangements," he said. "Prudent households adapt. Prudence does not run on cyanide," Dr. Haydock observed. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "It runs on tea, which we will pour." She did so, and the steam softened foreheads. They drank. Miss Marple let silence widen until it became a lane down which truth might amble, her believing itself unobserved. "Mr. Lanyon," she said, as if asking for a thread, "yesterday you said village displays pained the eye. Did Madam ever pain you with her plans?" "One works for standards," he replied a shade too quickly. "Madam appreciated mine, until she did not," Pritchard murmured. "Until Tuesday," Mrs. Simms's bag crackled. She patted it. "You spoke with Madam Friday about accounts," Weatherby said. "She meant to set them right publicly." "It disturbed me for the gentleman concerned," Mrs. Simms returned. "Public correction is indecent. I prefer a quiet change in the book." "Quiet changes do leave crescents," Miss Marple said, "and open tops on fours." Mrs. Simms flushed and looked at Mr. Lanyon. He arranged his hat brim with two thoughtful fingers. "There is a way the thing was done," Miss Marple went on. "A flat knot, a cracked saucer, a calling card slid beneath glass, a vial hidden in a chipped jug, a label dated by a hand that presses too hard. And there is a reason, the ordinary kind, employment pride, and the difficulty some men have with a woman who sets accounts straight in public." The room held its breath. "It will be simpler if we fetch the missing paper," Weatherby said. "Mr. Lanyon, you were in the parlor at noon. You will deliver it." Lanyon's face wore regret like mourning. "If such a paper exists, Sergeant, it will come through solicitors. I cannot conjure what the dead chose to mislay." "Dead ladies often hide in plain sight," Miss Marple said. "In an envelope about music, perhaps. Ladies like things to match." She drew from the lectern drawer the small parcel tied with two bows. She undid the common bow easily. The flat knot took a slower thumb. Inside lay only brown paper, no document. Yet the compressed crease of a flat knot stamped the fold like a memory. Before Weatherby could answer, Reed filled the doorway. "Sergeant Manor, fire in the scullery cupboard. Put out quick. Something's been scorched." They went like a small army. Smoke still tried to stay. The poison cupboard gaped raw. A shelf's edge charred. Labels curled. On the hearth, Mrs. Bligh held a pan with the authority of a general who has won by refusing to lose. "A rag," she said, "and the devil's own smell." Among the damp ash lay the ghost of a small green glass vial, glass crazed by heat. Beside it a curl of crimson ribbon. The lock bore scratches. On the sill a box of matches lay open, two gone. The cheap sulphury kind from the village shop. "Who was here?" Weatherby asked. "Me," said Mrs. Bligh, "and then nobody, and then me again." Hetty shook her head. Nash spread his large hands. Mr. Lanyon stood where smoke would not touch his jacket. "It appears," he observed, "that some guilty person wished to erase his folly." "Or some tidy person wished to finish the job," Miss Marple said. "Fire is the last refuge of the fastidious." She took from her reticule the bent safety pin and touched the scorched ribbon curl. The point came away faintly orange. "Sticky threads are loyal," she said. Mrs. Simms, who had hung back, stepped in with the pell-mell of a woman reaching the end of tidying. "I would not burn a cupboard," she blurted. "I keep drawers." "No one has accused you," Weatherby said. "Better to accuse than to leave it unsaid," she returned, and looked at Mr. Lanyon. He inclined his head with grace fraying at the edges. "If I had done wrong, Mrs. Simms, I would admit it perfectly." "Sergeant," Miss Marple said, very quiet, "let us return to the hall. There is one more piece that wishes to arrive." They went back in a purposeful line. The hall received them with the faint, scorched smell-duty leaves when hurried. Miss Marple sat where she could see the jug's reflection. Dolly took her hand like a schoolgirl, promising not to whisper. Time drew its neat pencil round 5 again. The door opened, hesitated, and admitted Lily. She looked as if running and not running had braided her legs. She carried something wrapped in a dish towel. "I went by the hedge," she said to Miss Marple. "Because you said hedges, remember, and this caught." She unwrapped a small packet. Blue paper folded twice around a calling card, bound with a narrow strip of crimson ribbon, whose ends had been cut as cleanly as words in a good book. The card's corner bore a faint green crescent. Mr. Lanyon allowed himself a breath, almost relief, as if a piece had returned to its place. "You see," he said, aiming at gentleness and reaching condescension, "the village dramatizes litter." Miss Marple opened the blue. Inside lay a half-ticket, 37, and a note in Adela Marchmont's hand. "Keep this proof." The downstroke of the P had been pressed so hard it showed through. There was a smudge of marmalade in the fold, and when she turned it, the ghost of a flat knot stamped into the paper. Proof of what? Weatherby asked. Of a list rewritten, Miss Marple said. Of a hand that counts out of turn. Of a plan to speak Tuesday that would not bear explaining. She tucked it into the card and tied it, because that is the language the culprit speaks, and she wished him to understand she had understood. Lanyon regarded the ribbon as a man looks at an old schoolmaster. If Madam meant to hint, he said, she has succeeded. The village, being English, dealt with calamity by arranging flowers at once. Mrs. Rowe arrived later with a jar done that morning, thin cut, bitter honest, and stood awkward in the doorway until Miss Marple rescued her into a chair. I kept thinking, she said, how it would feel to be the jar. She put the gift down carefully. I am grateful to you, Miss Marple, if that is permitted. It is always permitted, Miss Marple said. We do not help each other enough out loud. In the afternoon, a square drab van hove into the green, with the patient confidence of furniture that intends to remain. The piano had come, after all. Tuesday, as promised, though Tuesday had changed its mind about being celebratory. The carriers, practical men humming under their breath, shouldered it into the memorial hall as if bringing in a companionable cow. The room took on at once a more serious air, as rooms do when a piano sits down among them and expects to be consulted. Lanyon's notice, neatly printed, now stood beside the vicar's with a black border trimmed modestly. Mrs. Sims, who had slept badly and wept badly, and not tidied badly for the first time in her adult life, brought clean ledger pages and wrote the names into the subscription with 4s closed at the top. She did it slowly. The patience showed. When she reached L. Hewitt, lessons to commence, she paused, dabbed her eyes in a business-like fashion, and wrote as if squaring a sum were a promise not to a book, but to a girl. Lily came at 4 with her sleeves turned up and her hair attempting purpose. I don't know if I'm any good, she confessed to Miss Marple in a confidential panic one hears at altars and on first days. I can find middle C. That will take you remarkably far, Miss Marple said, and the rest is counting and kindness. Do not let the one trample the other. Hetty sat prim in the front row, hands folded accordingly. Mr. Pritchard hovered just inside the door like a conscientious draught, and then, with a little sound of surrender, crossed to the florist's table and set a shallow bowl of roses on the piano, as if apologizing to it for not having arrived yesterday. No leaks, he told Dolly in a whisper that could not help being superior. A piano resents damp. Dr. Haydock came to say the coroner would be satisfied by the confession, the analysis, and the narrative of means. He added, because he was a doctor and therefore licensed to be kindly rude, that people who prefer flat knots should be made to wear their collars unstarched for a year as penance. It might relax the species, he said. He took Miss Marple's thin hand and patted it with the professional air of a man examining a pulse and finding common sense. The small ceremony that followed was neither proud nor abject. The vicar spoke briefly of gifts used in service. Mrs. Goodbody cried in the open manner of stout women, whose tears are wholesome. Mrs. Rowe's mouth took on the defiant firmness of someone who has been suspected and decides she will not be again. Weatherby said that the hall would be open Wednesdays and Saturdays for lessons, and Lily blushed, as a person does who learns her name has become a task. Dolly leaned to Miss Marple and whispered, It is lovely, Jane, to see Hope being noisy. Hope is the only thing that already knows the tune, Miss Marple said. We are all just catching up. In the days that followed, the village practiced the complicated art of returning to itself. There were inevitably versions. Some said it had been the marmalade from the start, and they had known. Some said they had suspected the ribbon and were too delicate to mention it. Mrs. Sims told her cousin she intended to keep the torn page, singular and labelled error retained, lesson, and the cousin, who makes cakes that are more admired than eaten, declared it the most radical thing she had ever heard and asked for a copy. Mr. Pritchard, disconcerted by how much of himself he had recognized in the villain and determined not to say so aloud, brought flowers to the hall twice a week thereafter and looked away. Embarrassed by his own gentleness when the girls practiced, he also bought a new jug and did not speak of it to anyone. As for Mr. Lanyon, the newspapers reported nothing creepier than household manager held, which is how newspapers apologize for not being quite sure what class a man belongs to. He went away with dignity, and Miss Marple thought an odd relief. Some people find absolution in being told what they have done. She did not hate him. She never could hate anyone who had so thoroughly believed that being neat would save him. It is a dreadful thing to trust a habit, as if it were a principle. There fails one in the end for want of a soul. One afternoon, Miss Marple walked the hedge and found, in a thorn she had been watching for 3 days, a final confession, a last short crimson thread that the sparrows had not wanted after all. She smiled and left it there, an epigraph written in lint. When she returned, Dolly was waiting with a tray and the unconvincing air of a woman who has not eaten half the biscuits already. "Tell me why it was called what it was called," Dolly demanded without preface. "Hope, fear, betrayal. Do you always name them, Jane?" "People carry those like coins," Miss Marple said, folding her knitting with exactness that had nothing in it of Lanyon's zeal. "Hope is what Mrs. Rowe wrapped her jars in. Fear is what Mr. Lanyon wrapped his pride in. Betrayal is what Mrs. Marchmont felt when she discovered how her standards had been used against her." "Only," she poured, thinking how steam fogs a room into confession, "only it is not so simple. Hope, fear, betrayal are always cousins. They borrow each other's hats. One must look at the shape of the head." "And you?" Dolly said softly. "What did you wear?" "Curiosity," Miss Marple answered. "Old and not very fashionable, but it keeps one warm." She set down her cup. "Also memory. Villages repeat themselves. One simply waits for the rhyme." From the hall there floated, not very correctly but with enthusiastic courage, the first halting bars of a scale. Lily's left hand, stubborn as a good heart, found its place. Children do not know they are putting a town back together when they lean into a key at the same moment. They are only trying not to be scolded. Yet the sound ran along the green and into kitchens, and even into Mrs. Simms's ledger, as she wrote her 4s properly closed and, with a little tremble, her 7s leaning but upright. The bandmaster, passing, took off his hat and stood for a moment to listen in unprofessional satisfaction. Sergeant Weatherby stopped at the gate. "I suppose," he said, "we shall call it settled. Until the next," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "Life does not abstain for long. But for now, yes. Only do not let the hall return that saucer to the back of the cupboard. Leave it out. It will do people good to see that one can rest cups on floors without the table collapsing." He smiled with the shy tenderness tidy men feel toward sensible women. "How you are a terror," he said respectfully, and went away much happier than he would have admitted. Twilight came up the lane like a hushed aunt. The roses in the garden let go of their day in a sigh of scent. Miss Marple took up her needles again, and Dolly, half asleep and wholly at peace, made a small contented sound that might have been a cat in another house and another story. The stitch went on. Plain, purl, plain. Action, motive, consequence. Somewhere a child miscounted and began again, which is the beginning of music and of living decently. St. Mary Mead, having been shown itself and being on the whole tolerant, forgave what it could and put the rest into drawers where it might be found when useful. On the mantel, beside the small clock that had ticked through war and ration and scandal, Miss Marple kept the bent safety pin and the half-ticket tucked into her housekeeping book. Not trophies, reminders. That people reveal themselves in the very motions by which they try to hide. That knots like lies have familiar signatures. That kindness spoken publicly can be a greater courage than any quiet concealment. She thought of Adela Marchmont, who had intended a speech and had not been allowed to make it. Miss Marple made it for her now, wordlessly, with every small thing put right in its place and left a little visible, like the crack beneath the jug. Night took the village politely. Somewhere a fox argued with its dinner. Somewhere a door was locked with the care of a woman who has learnt that locks are not assurances, but courtesies. The piano, covered and companionable, kept its counsel. Miss Marple set out 2 saucers, one cracked and one sound, and put the cups down on the cracked because people profit from practice. She and Dolly drank, and after a time the friend went home and the old lady, who was not old where nonsense is concerned, wound her wool and put out her lamp. The mystery, having walked its road, had come to a place that was not quite an ending and not at all a beginning, but something homelier, a village remembering how to be itself, under the sensible eye of a woman who never confuses neatness with goodness and never forgets where the thread caught.